everyone, and welcome to this session of ARCS Forward and the National Scholar Speaker Series. For the next hour, we will be talking with Dr. Paula Diehr, who was the very first woman selected to receive an ARCS Scholar Award while she attended Harvey Mudd College. Her contributions to scientific research over the years have been substantial. I am Beth Wainwright, ARCS Foundation National President, and it is my honor to be moderating our session today. I am also a founding member of the Pittsburgh chapter. As National President, I do want to say a few words about ARCS Foundation, which stands for Achievement Rewards for College Scientists. Our mission is to advance science in the United States by providing financial awards to academically outstanding U.S. citizens studying to complete degrees in STEM. We believe that support of STEM education is essential to U.S. economic growth, technological competitiveness, and continued global leadership. ARCS Foundation is a woman-founded, women-led organization with a successful 65-year history of furthering our mission and being a leader in scientific philanthropy. ARCS Forward, our National Scholar Speakers Series, features ARCS scholars and scholar alums, scientists from across the ARCS Foundation network of 15 chapters. We welcome our members, scholars, and guests today, and thank you all for joining us. A little housekeeping. We will not be doing a formal Q&A, but as you have already been doing, please feel free to use the chat box to share your thoughts with others and with us. Our session today is titled Ahead of the Bell Curve, which aptly describes our guest speaker. Allow me to introduce our 2024 ARCS Hall of Fame inductee, Dr. Paula Diehr. Paula Diehr, PhD, is an esteemed statistician and emeritus professor at the University of Washington, Seattle, whose influential work has significantly impacted both the fields of statistics and medical research. Dr. Diehr is recognized for her pioneering work as a biostatistician. Over her distinguished career, she has made substantial contributions to health services research, epidemiology, and biostatistics, particularly in the development and application of statistical methods to address complex health-related issues. Dr. Diehr's research focused on creating methods for turning large data on thousands of people, into meaningful information for improving medical practice and healthcare outcomes. Her contributions have had a profound impact on both medicine and statistics. Her methodologies have been widely adopted by healthcare professionals, policymakers, and researchers, leading to more informed decisions that improve patient care and health outcomes. Her contributions as a biostatistician have had notable economic impact. Her research has helped policymakers and healthcare providers allocate resources more effectively to impact healthcare efficiency and resource allocation. Her research has informed decisions on which treatments or interventions provide the best outcomes relative to their costs and has allowed cost effectiveness to impact health interventions. Her research has influenced policies designed to reduce the burden on healthcare systems while improving patient quality of life, which has impacted long-term care and health outcome research. Dr. Diehr was one of the first biostatisticians and leaders in this field. Such research methods simply didn't exist before her work, ahead of the bell curve. So now, Dr. Diehr, welcome, and thank you for taking time to speak to us today. We are anxious to hear about your work directly from you. So I know that you've had a cold, as you told me last week, so we all particularly thank you for being with us. And if anytime you feel you need to take a break, please let me know. So today we're going to talk a little bit about your background, your what got you to where to lead you to your research, some about your career as a PhD researcher, mentoring, service, and then we'll end with the accomplishments that you're most proud of. So with that, let's just jump right in. You were our first woman ARCS scholar. So how did you learn about your award and that you were receiving, and what was it like? What impact did it have on your education?
First of all, I want to thank you very much for this honor. I really appreciate being noticed here. I've been retired for 15 years now, so it's nice to have an opportunity to look back on some of my work. I was born in the Midwest, but I moved to California when I was in the between the third and fourth grade. It was meaningful because in Wisconsin, they teach cursive writing in the fourth grade, and in California, they teach it in the third grade. So this is one of the many occasions when I had to just go and learn something on my own rather than getting to do it in class. This has happened later on in my career as well. I was a good student, and I didn't really have anything that I was not good at. So I hadn't really decided what my career was going to be. I never really thought about that in high school. But because of Sputnik, the Russians put out a
spaceship.
Satellite.
Yes, right.
Yeah. And we realized that the country was far behind the Russians in terms of science. And so suddenly there was a lot of interest in supporting science and creating more scientists. I'm sure that's part of the background from the ARCS as well to do this. At any rate, so when I did apply to college, I applied as a chemist, mainly because I liked my chemistry teacher. I didn't really have any particular thing in mind. I applied to 3 colleges, and one, I assumed I would go to UCLA because it was the local public college. I once dated a boy who went to Stanford, so I applied to Stanford. And I went to meet somebody who came to our high school from Harvey Mudd College. And among the other things he told me about Harvey Mudd was that they hardly ever admitted girls. So of course I applied there. And later on, I did get accepted to all of them. And finally, after all that, I told my father where I had applied, and he said, "What? You've got to go to a small school." So there we are. And so I went to Harvey Mudd, since UCLA and Stanford are hardly small schools. I was very pleased to get these scholarships, and of course, it just changed my life to go to college. Harvey Mudd is one of the colleges at Claremont. And it was, at that time, it was so new. I was only in the 3rd graduating class that they didn't even have women's dorms, or as they called them, girls' dorms. So I lived at Scripps College, which was a girls' college that emphasized social sciences and art and humanities. And they jokingly said they all learned gracious living. So that's where I learned all my gracious living, was living at Scripps. later on, I discovered that I really wasn't very good at labs. And I had to spend 12 hours a week in labs, one for physics, one for chemistry, and one for engineering. So when I went on sophomore year, junior year, I got to choose a major, and I chose math, which did not have any labs. And that left me a lot more time to do some things that I liked that were different, like take psychology and take languages and things. And those classes, it turns out, were just as helpful to me as my math classes.
So how did it feel? I mean, you were a woman, and how did you get to the research part then when you were into taking math and subjects such as that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't really. I graduated with my degree in math, and it was kind of a funny story. They apparently sent a questionnaire around saying, what are you going to do when you get out of college? And I had no idea what I was going to do. So I may have just not filled it in. And so our yearbook says that I was going to be a housewife. So that was never my plan. My plan was to get out of college and look for a job. And so I was going to go live at home with my mother. So I just called around places around where she lived. And I managed to find something at ITT Federal Labs. It was working in artificial intelligence. Now you realize this was so many years ago. This was 1959, but there hardly had any computers. And I worked with these people, and the only thing I really did was teach myself to program a computer. And so I wrote some programs to invert matrices and to generate random variables, but random data. But the whole thing fell apart before I ever got to see any results. So I was just then transferred over to another part of ITT, and I worked. One of the things that I discovered there was I was helping them write a personnel program. And I discovered that I was terribly underpaid and compared to where I should have been. So I decided to leave, and then they decided to give me more money. So that was one of the few times that I've really noticed that I've been discriminated against for being a woman.
Well, so I want to make the leap and understand then, how did you get into the work of a biostatistician? What was the career path that led you to that? Because that's how we recognize you as
right
ahead of the bell curve.
Well, as I say, I was a programmer for several years with ITT Federal Labs, and it was a perfectly nice job. Then sort of this chain reaction, my college roommate decided to go to law school, which meant that her husband had to go get a PhD so that he could go to school with her, which meant that my husband had to go get a PhD, which eventually ended up with my going back for what I thought was going to be a master's degree. And so I went to UCLA and was working on a master's in math. In fact, this was just the first full semester I was there. And I heard about this other program called Biostatistics. Now I had a statistics program at Harvey Mudd, and that was one of the few things that really turned me on was the probability in statistics. So I went over and talked to them at UCLA in this new program of biostatistics. And long story short, I transferred over there in the middle of the semester. In the middle of second semester, I transferred into this program. And turns out I had a lot better math background than the other students in the program. So I was able to actually do all the work. My plan was I would just finish up second semester, and then I'd wait, and then fall I would do first semester, and then I'd get a master's in biostat. Then UCLA switched to the quarter system. And the one class that I needed to get was going to be almost a year away and they wouldn't let me out of it. I was just so surprised. So while I was waiting for this one class to come around again, I took the PhD classes and ended up getting a doctorate in biostatistics. So there was quite a bit of chance involved in this, but lucky me, I mean, it was really a great career for me.
It does sound like there was a lot of chance in this, and that which is so interesting in how you built upon your degree. And I remember you indicated that you were married at the time, and what impact did that have on your ability to continue your career?
Well, at the time, it was great. I had a husband to drive me to UCLA and back and things. And he was very supportive of my being a graduate student. After a while, it turned out that I was pregnant, and I had not expected that. And right about that time, my husband got a job offer at the University of Washington. And so without my really giving it any thought at all, we just moved to Seattle with this brand new baby. And I had finished my exams, fortunately, at UCLA,
Awesome.
had not started just a dissertation. So I did go talk to one professor who I thought had interesting ideas, Dr. Dixon, and he agreed to be my sponsor, but we only talked for a few hours. So I pretty much didn't have much more than a slight idea of what a dissertation would be.
I remember, though, you talked about the fact that because you were in Washington, in the University of Washington, and you were doing research for back in California, that you were really ahead of the curve. You were doing remote work when now it's such a big thing.
I certainly never thought of it that way, but you're right. I had a lot of trouble getting used to being in Seattle, where I didn't know anybody, and had a new baby, and had this guilt thing about my dissertation. My husband then insisted that we get a babysitter, and so I would then go spend a few hours every day at the University of Washington Library and work on my dissertation. So I did manage to get that done. But you're right. I used the University of Washington's computer because my husband had an account, and did most of my work there on that computer. But then for my final runs and things, I had to mail everything down to UCLA, where I paid one of my fellow graduate students to do all the runs for me. And so I guess I was kind of working remotely, right?
Yes, I would call that remote work.
Uh-huh.
So how did you get from your research to creating the impact that you did in the world of biostatistician?
Well, I want to give UCLA some more credit that they were very nice to me. You know, they let me join in the middle of the semester, and they funded me, and they kept funding me even though I moved to Seattle. And that was partly because they hadn't had much luck in students finishing. At some point, though, they decided that I was never going to finish, and so they were going to cut me off. And so immediately I said, "Oh, okay." So I got a job, and I finished my dissertation, and I was a success. I was one of their outstanding alumni, they said a while ago. So that all worked out really well. But so I did do my dissertation, and when I looked for a job the same way I did when I got out of college, is I just called around, or I wrote around, and there was a very new department of biostatistics at University of Washington, so it was recommended to me that I just go hang out there. and maybe something would happen. And I did have an offer to do some night teaching at one of the other colleges in Seattle, but turns out I got a full-time offer at UW after that. So that was very fortunate. Things are a lot tighter now. It's like much harder to get into university, but when you get into a new department, a lot of time, there are a lot of opportunities that might not happen later on. Anyway, you asked me about my research. Well, I didn't really have any research. I mean, I had my dissertation research, which was completely computer-based. And I really, because I spent so little time at UCLA, I didn't really have an applied area. So it turns out that the chairman of the department, Donovan Thompson, love him, had 2 grants that he was hoping not to have to work on. And both of them were in the area of health services research. And one of them was to start up a master's program to teach people health services research, even though I had had only 1 class in my entire graduate program on that. And the other was to work on help be the statistician on a big project we called the Model Cities Project, where it was a big project that in city of Seattle provided health insurance to low-income people, and half of them went to group health and half of them got a fee-for-service, sort of a Blue Cross program. And so I was the statistician for that. I've lost track of where we were going with it.
We were just talking about how you got into the field of biostatistics and how you built your career on that.
Yeah. Well, so I didn't really know what I was supposed to be doing on the research part, but I was a computer programmer. So I said, all right, I'll handle all the computer parts of this, which I did. And then it actually got too big for me, and I couldn't handle it after that. The project went on maybe 5 years, and about publish or perish, that I was, of course, expected to write papers. Well, this project went on 5 years. It took up all of my time, and at the end, none of the other faculty wrote any papers. So I had spent 5 years and not gotten anything, to show for it. So it turns out that I was supposed to write one of the papers for the project, which was a surprise to me. I really thought I was just going to do the analysis and do the computer work. But they asked me to do a paper about whether people's health improved with this new health insurance problem, where all these people got free health insurance. And it was kind of a shock to me. I was a pretty good writer of personal essays and things, but I had never really done anything serious. And not only that, but I didn't really know anything about health insurance or health for that matter, because I had spent so little time at UCLA. So I think about how hard that paper was to write, because I couldn't do the literature review because I didn't know where to look. And so I ended up just going around and talking to people and saying, have you ever heard of a study that looked to see whether health insurance improved people's health? And doing that, I managed to find about 10 studies to compare ours to that did have that kind of information. Nowadays, I could go on the internet. I could find, in a few minutes, I could find a lot of general studies that had been very similar to this. I could find things where people had written all about it and said, these are the important questions, the important papers beside it. But then, really, I just had to learn it in the gutter, so to speak. So that was good. It turned out I wrote a good paper. It was a big surprise to everyone. It was one of the few papers that got written out of this big 5-year project, because what happened is that a lot of people, once their funding ended, they had to move on to other projects. So I was left there without very many papers and with the data. And so some person came over and asked me, say, could we look at whether HMOs are different from fee for service? And I said, sure, we could do that. And so this gave me the idea of actually using data I already had to answer questions. And after a while, I kind of learned what the questions were. And then I was pretty successful after that. We started out doing how mental health was done in the two different kind of insurance programs, and kind of just went on from there.
I'm so interested in hearing you talk about this, because it seems to me that you didn't have a clear path, but you certainly took advantage of any opportunity, and you sought opportunities for your career.
Yeah, this sort of happened. I discovered later that the other statisticians in my department felt sorry for me because I was in this health services research area. I wasn't doing cancer and I wasn't doing heart, the things that everybody else was working on. Turns out I think this was a real advantage for me, to working in something nobody else knew about, that almost anything I did was new and important. So I really enjoyed that.
And took advantage of it. So yeah. Did you have mentors along the way that helped you during your career?
Well, not as many as I would have liked, actually. When I was at Harvey Mudd prides itself on getting all the students to work collaboratively, and the boys all worked collaboratively. They stayed up at night in the dorms and ate pizza and did all their homework together and things. I was living at Scripps. I had to be in by 10:30. There was no way I could do any of that collaboration. So I ended up pretty much working on my own. I did have, faculty mentors, of course, but they weren't familiar with health services research either. So I did in time get to work with some of the senior health services people. But pretty much I had to figure these things out along with everybody else. My department chairman was wonderful, and my colleagues, the other faculty members were good to me and helped me figure out some of the ropes. But pretty much the professional stuff I had to do on my own.
That's amazing to me, and the impact of your career. So, did you mentor individual students behind you, scholars behind you, PhD researchers?
I did, but because my funding was almost 100% grants and contracts, I didn't do very much teaching, which meant the number of students I attracted was limited. I had 2 dissertation students, Laura and Anne, and I had maybe 20 master students, and then probably another 100 where I was on their committees, but I wasn't their chair. So definitely things like that. And then there's sort of informal mentoring where they come and ask you, when should I have a baby? And
well, you were a role model, certainly, for that.
I was a young mother, right? And my answer was, there's no good time. So they mostly ended up having them in.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested in how you've given back. You received the ARCS Award, which was a recognition of your ability, your what Harvey recognized your skills in you, your talents in you. So have you been able to give back and serve in other ways?
Well, we're supposed to be faculty are supposed to be doing teaching, research, and service. And I did a lot of service because I was a statistician. Right about the time I joined the faculty, NIH, bless their hearts, decided that every project had to have a statistician. Before they didn't, but these doctors would just write things up and say, this makes sense to me, and write it up. But they didn't have a statistician go over the numbers to see if their approach was right, to see if they really had significant results. So there was a huge demand for biostatisticians. And NIH also determined that all of their review committees should have a statistician on them. Mm-hmm. And never mind that there was also a women's movement. And so NIH wanted women. So I was sort of a 2-for-1 there, being a woman and a statistician. So I actually got onto a lot of government committees for reviewing grants very early in my career. And that turned out to be a really good thing for me. It was a huge amount of work because it was completely separate from my faculty work. But well, what it meant was I had to read 30 or 40 grant proposals 3 times a year, go on site visits to visit these projects, and then write something up about telling the good and bad points of each one. So this was a huge amount of work in addition to everything else. But it did mean that I met other people from other faculties who were on these committees, and it really gave me some national exposure. And that turned out to be important, at least for getting promoted, that I knew somebody knew who I was.
So let's talk a little bit about what are you most proud of? What accomplishments are you most proud of? I know your work in the health sciences area. So you mentioned when we talked before about a t-test and the significance of this. If you could explain a little bit and give us some examples.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me say that although I sound kind of casual about all this, I really ticked all the boxes. I really had a very successful career. I am a fellow in most of the societies that I belong to. I'm an outstanding alum in various things. One of the things that I thought was, well, because I was in 2 departments, I was in biostatistics and in health services research. Most of my work was in health services research and was applied papers, but I did actually have some statistical papers. And one of them did have to do with this t-test. This is something that was developed 150 years ago. And I'm trying to think about how to explain it to this audience. I decided that you might want to think about it as thinking about election results and how when they're reported, they say, and there's the margin of, these are within the margin of error. They're not within the margin of error. Okay, a t-test is something developed 150 years ago to decide whether the difference in the average of 2 groups was within the margin of error or not. And if it's not in the margin of error, then you say, statistically significant results. So 150 years ago, and this test has been used forever, and I discovered something new about it. And it's not a very useful thing, but it was just really tickled me that if you have a really small sample size, like 3 or 4 people in each group, in my case, they were communities in each group, that you might want to match communities before you assign treatments, but that you should analyze it so it's unmatched. I mean, it's a very, very screwy thing, but I was able to show it. I showed it by computer simulation because I was a computer person. So, later on, somebody else was able to prove it mathematically as well. So it wasn't very useful because when you're down with such a small number, you could hardly ever find a significant result anyway. But it tickled me that there were still things to be found, even in this really old research work.
So moving on, what about your BMI, and I love your comments about this. The relationship with mortality is different in older adults and in younger people. And I'm sure there are a lot on this call that would be interested in knowing more about this.
Well, let me say that one of the themes of my life, well, I'll just go back to my dissertation for a minute, that I did write this up, and I was all having to do with computer simulation. And when I went to defend it, the committee said, well, you don't have any real data in there. And I said, real data? Where would I get that? So my thesis advisor said, oh, here's a book with some real data in it. Why don't you use that? So I did. I typed it in and applied my methods to this real data. But I guess that it must have really stuck with me, because every project I had after that, I ended up with the data. And I found there were often clever things to do with it that had nothing to do with the original project. Anyway, that's not what you asked me. You asked me about the BMI. So there's a big project that I became a part of, the cardiovascular health study. And the main idea there was to follow older people, just to follow them over time and measure the heck out of them, just measure all sorts of things about them. And most of the people on the project were very interested in looking at their calcium levels and things. But I didn't know anything about those things. So what I was interested in was their health. And then we had a lot of measures about how is your health, and can you perform the activities of daily living, how fast can you walk, some things like that that nobody else really cared about. So I just ended up writing papers about using variables in this study that nobody else cared about. Anyway, one thing I happened to get into was looking at body mass index. And you've probably heard this term. I like it a lot, even though it gets disparaged, because if you use this variable, it's weight over the square of your height. And it turns out, at least for older adults, that this is almost completely independent of how tall you are. So if we have, you wouldn't want to say some basketball player is fatter than you are, because in fact he's just taller, so he weighs more. So you do want to adjust for height. Anyway, that weight over height squared actually is a really very good way to get rid of height in your analysis.
So it's better for, it's not better, it's all right to gain a little weight when you get older. Is that it?
Okay, I haven't gotten to that yet. So body mass index is this thing, and it was developed probably on younger people, and it's considered by a lot of people to be a measure of fatness, although there's a lot of disagreement about that. So a really low body mass index would mean you're too thin, and something in between would be you're just right, and then really high would be obese. So just as a byproduct, some other things, I started looking at the cutoffs that they used for defining what is normal weight and what is obese and what is regular weight, and normal weight and overweight. And it turns out, and it's a thing that nobody admits, but everybody finds, is that what's called overweight is actually the healthiest weight, at least for older adults. And I've just seen this in so many places. And what I mean by that is, if you take a bunch of people and you get their weight and you calculate their body mass index, that the people who are, quote, overweight, have a BMI 25 to 30, actually do better on almost every measure you have. Not a lot better. They're really pretty similar to normal weight. But that what's bothersome about this is that we're talking about this obesity epidemic. And usually when they talk about obesity, they're combining the overweight and the obese. and saying, my God, 40% of the people in the country are obese or overweight. But the truth is the overweight ought to be combined with the normal weight, because they have very similar health prognosis. So I feel that I have solved the obesity epidemic just by relabeling.
Relabeling. Well, for those of us as we get older and gain a little bit of weight, it's nice to know that it's not going to harm us. So I do have a couple other questions, and one that I know that you're passionate about, and that's that healthy lifespan, the healthy life calculator. So can you tell us a little bit and explain that, particularly for our audience?
Well, I would be very happy to do that. It's one of the last projects that I had. And it was, again, using this cardiovascular health study data that people had been studied for 25 years, followed for 25 years. And one of my research interests is, if you have data on somebody for 25 years, sometimes they don't give it, sometimes they die. What do you do with that in the analysis? And that was one of my research interests. But at any rate, one of the interesting things was, to me, was how long people live, but also how long are they healthy? And also, how long are they able to perform all the activities of daily living? If you're not familiar with that term, it's things, really easy things like, can you get out of bed yourself? Can you use the toilet? Can you get dressed and things? And so I just thought, why didn't I use all this data that I had to make a calculator to help people estimate how long they would live, how long they would be healthy, and how long they would be able to do all the activities of daily living. And then finally, I just combined it. And suppose you're healthy and able to do all the activities of daily living. That's the best thing. So, being a statistician, I knew how to do this. I had 1,000 variables that I could use as predictors. And I just had to make up some rules, and I tried to use only things that I thought people could answer all by themselves without having to go to their medical records or talk to the doctors. So I end up having a calculator that will estimate, if you answer these 20 questions, I think it will give you an estimate of how many years of life you have ahead of you. How many years of life an average person like you has. You, of course, could drop dead tomorrow. And how many years of healthy life and how many years of healthy and able life. Now, then I published this, and the fun part for me is that I wanted to be on the web. So I got my son to help me with this. And so he put it up on the internet. He's a PhD in psychology, but this is the only time we've ever worked together. So it was really fun. One disappointment to me is that it hasn't been picked up. I was hoping it would go viral. Only maybe 5,000 people have ever used it. But I still think it could be very useful if people knew more about it. So that's why I wanted to talk here. It's available at healthylifecalculator.org. And if you were to use it, you would just answer 20 questions, and it would give you some point estimates, an estimate of how many good years you have left. But also, if you look a little harder, it will tell you how accurate that estimate is. It will tell you a range of possible values. And what I've noticed about the competition is that no other calculator you find online tells you where the numbers came from, how they came up with those recommendations. And I suspect that they just made them up in some cases. I don't know, but mine is more scientific, so I like it better. Anyway, my personal use for it is getting on in years. I really ought to be downsizing so I can move to a retirement place, but I'm kind of lazy. So I look in the Healthy Life Calculator, and discovered that people like me have an average of 8 good years ahead of them. So I say to myself, well, okay, I can wait a little longer before I downsize. I don't have to rush into anything. Now, if it had said 2 healthy years, I'd think, wow, I really have to do this right now, start downsizing right now. And I think it seems to me this should be useful for a lot of other people. It's for people 65 and older. And you promised me there'd be some people that age in this audience.
Well, for one, I'm here. I tried your healthy life calculator and I was quite pleased with the results it gave me.
Oh, I'm glad.
So I don't have to empty my attic right now.
Okay. Right.
So
Right.
how, you mentioned in your talk about some rules that you developed. Now, is there such a thing as a Diehr rule? RULE?
Well, this is something I did very early on. I was working with the Army had decided not to have doctors see some of their soldiers for common problems. They decided to have corpsmen do it. So they trained the corpsmen, but then they needed to evaluate whether they were actually doing a good job. So what they did was come up with a checklist. And the corpsman, when he saw a patient, would have to check off all this information about them, and then they would come up with a diagnosis. The thrill for me was these checklists that were data and were computerized eventually, and I could actually use them to do various things that had nothing to do with what they wanted. And one of the things was a really special part of this data. They were trying to diagnose pneumonia. And so they actually, at one point in this study, they did a chest x-ray of everyone who came in with a cough. And so they wrote a paper, the doctors I was working with wrote a paper about do doctors make good decisions? And the answer was no, they made terrible decisions. But I decided, why not just write a paper about predicting pneumonia from the kind of stuff that was on that checklist. And so I did that, and I came up with a pretty easy formula that one could use to predict whether a person had pneumonia. And so I published this paper. And about 20 years later, one of my colleagues was using the paper in class, and one of her students, who was an MD, said, "Oh, this is a very famous paper. This is in all the medical books and things." And I wrote it so long ago, there was no way for me to trace this. I had no idea. And apparently, it's I mean, I've seen it. It's on the internet, called the Diehr rule. So if you ever have a cough and if you wonder if you have pneumonia, you can look up the Diehr rule and put in your data.
How interesting. Yeah. Your career has just been so interesting, and you've taken advantage and been creative, and it's just so interesting to listen to you. So I wonder now, what do you do that you're retired? What keeps you busy?
Well, retiring it's kind of hard to say what retired is when you're doing research. That I just made a rule to myself, and I said, I'm not going to take on any more projects. I'm just going to wait until I get down below 50% funding, which affected whether I got health insurance anymore. And once I dropped down below 50%, I retired. But of course, I still had that 49% of grant funding that had to be done. So I've spent a fair amount of time still doing biostatistics, even though I'm officially retired. What I liked about, I was really panicked about retiring. I thought, what will I do with all my time? And I was able to, fortunately, be able to retire very gradually, that going down to 49%, and then to 25%, and then to 10%. And I certainly managed to fill in the rest of the time. Usual travel and family. Also, I joined a book group that reads a book a week on the quarter system. So there's some time off. I'm off right now. I'm going to read Huckleberry Finn on my way down to California next week, and read James on the way back. And then I'll be ready for our next discussions. I really have missed the opportunity to do that. I'm catching up on old television and old movies as well.
You're just enjoying life, it sounds as if. So
yeah,
I have a question. How would you like to be remembered?
Well, I want people to remember that I was a good statistician and a good health services researcher. I think I'll be remembered because I've created a fund a scholarship fund for health services researchers. I think I did it all, and I'm pleased with it. And I think that you were going to ask me again about whether I would recommend that people go into STEM. That STEM gives you so many tools to do things, and you just never know what you're going to end up doing. I certainly didn't think I was going to be working on pneumonia prediction when I was at Harvey Med, but I ended up with tools to do things like that. I think it's a great career. So I'm really quite happy with my career in retrospect.
Well, we are excited. The comments that are appearing in the chat box are all so positive. We're so happy that you were able to be with us today to talk about your career. Is there anything we missed that you would like to say?
Oh, probably.
Well, we covered a lot of territory.
Well, I did have a note. I was going to say that I mentioned that people felt sorry for me, that I was not in heart, not in cancer. But the truth, it was wonderful being in health services research because everybody was doing something different. And we worked on just really fun things. I told you about, I was working with health insurance data, which is reasonably boring. But there were a bunch of people interested in doing health promotion. So I got involved in a lot of studies about that. Health promotion in the workplace. Is it effective to put signs near the elevator saying, "Why don't you walk up the stairs instead?" And such things. I don't think it turned out to be that. One of the fun ones I was the statistician for involved firemen in uniform going to houses of older adults and trying to convince them to put up a thing called the heart attack survival kit. And the heart attack survival kit was this very clever thing. It just said, in case of heart attack, dial 911. And then you open it up and there was some aspirin in it. And one of the things that we did, we evaluated this by having divided Seattle up into a whole lot of areas, and the firemen went to some of the areas and not to the other areas. And then we evaluated by seeing how many 911 calls there were in the different areas. And this actually turned out to be effective, that people really did dial 911 more in the areas that the firemen visited. And not only that, the firemen loved it. It was just the people who were visited loved it. It was one of the few positive health promotion things I've ever been involved with.
We've had so much fun talking with you today, and I just think we haven't even begun to learn everything that you've done in your career. But we are coming up upon the hour, so I really want to recognize you as an ARCS scholar, for your long career and stellar career. And You have made your mark on the world. Harvey Mudd saw your potential and believed you with the ARCS Award. And you are a prime example of the outstanding scholars that our 15 ARCS chapters support. So as we heard today, your award made an impact on you, and it makes an impact on many of our young scholars. We really want to thank you so much for being with us today. And you did answer what I was going to ask you as my last question, but you did indicate about the importance of young people who are interested in STEM and encourage them to enter STEM because of the tools that we get, or they get, sorry, excuse me, for entering the STEM field. Yes, so thank you again, Paula, if I may call you that, for being with us today. It has been delightful to hear you and listen to you, and congratulations on your induction into the ARCS Hall of Fame. And thank you to everyone for tuning into this session today. We will send out a link to the recording for you to share with others. You will also receive a survey. Please let us know if there is a topic of interest to you. We really, really use the survey to design our sessions, so please return them. And thank you again, Paula, and to everyone, have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you again.